Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Wonderland of Words, an event supported by EZHUTHOLA, where we celebrate English language in all its glory. At the heart of today's session is A Wonderland of Words, an enchanting and educating book by none other than Dr. Shashi Tharoor, a multi-hyphenate, grandiloquent, periphrastic champion of English language. In this book, Dr. Tharoor takes us on a delightful journey through the wild, wacky, weird, wonderful world of English, from punctuation to palindromes, acronyms to backronyms, idioms to oxymorons, and much more. With wit and passion, he unveils the history, evolution, and beauty of language that has captured his boundless curiosity. Joining him in conversation is Aienla Ozukum, publishing director at ALF Book Company, whose expertise and insights will enrich this discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our speakers this morning.
Morning, everyone. My apologies for looking like a Tamil Nadu politician, but I have very sensitive eyes, and staring at the sun will not do me much good. So forgive me for keeping this on, but I promise you I'll speak straight from the heart anyway.
Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be here at this wonderful venue with the sea breeze blowing, and just to spend a couple of minutes talking about a book that we are very proud to have published. Dr. Shashi Tharoor needs no introduction whatsoever, but I'm going to say something that adds to what we already know about him. To my mind, he's India's greatest wordsmith and the #1 best-selling author of stellar nonfiction in the country today. I've singled out these two aspects of his expansive CV because they come together brilliantly in the book that we'll be discussing this morning, A Wonderland of Words, Around the World in 101 Essays. In the book, Dr. Tharoor, the book shows to best effect his extraordinary facility with the English language, and it is already a bestseller. In the book, Dr. Tharoor takes us on a wonderfully entertaining and enlightening journey of the English language. In 101 essays, he delves into every important aspect of the language in a lucid, witty, and accessible way. Welcome, Dr. Tharoor, to what I believe will be a delightful session.
Thank you, Aienla. I must say the most important thing to say about the book is it's meant to be fun. That you're supposed to enjoy it. There should be a laugh every second page at least, so enjoy it in that spirit.
Yeah. So this session will feature the author's comments, insights, and readings of excerpts from the book.
Sure.
Dr. Tharoor, you're a self-confessed logophile and bibliophile. Tell us how and where your enduring love for words and books first took root.
You know, and it really goes back to my childhood. First of all, I think in many ways it was partly inherited from my father, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But it was also acquired because of my childhood asthma. I was really a very ill youngster. I happened to be born in London. My parents moved back to India when I was 2.5, and I immediately developed very severe asthma. And those were the days before television, before Nintendo or PlayStation, before computers or mobile phones. Literally, the only thing one could do was to read. On top of that, it was also the days before inhalers and ventilators and nebulizers and so on. So all I could do was take these very strong pills the doctors gave, which made my heart go thump, thump, thump like a big brass band, and kept me awake. So I would be unable to sleep, unable to lie down because I couldn't breathe, since you couldn't get the breath out of your lungs with asthma. Couldn't go out and play with my friends. What on earth do I do? So I became a crazy reader from a very young age. And I read widely, indiscriminately. I was the youngest child, the oldest child in the family, so I didn't have elder brothers or sisters to borrow books from. I would start reading my parents' books before I was old enough to understand any of them. But as a result, I fell in love with reading, and I fell in love with words. And I think that's essentially the answer to your question. But I was encouraged by my father, who grew up in a Kerala village, went to a government school in Alathur, went to England and sort of almost taught himself English from scratch. And again, he fell in love with the language and shared that love with us. So when me and my children, my sisters were growing up, his children, he would play word games with us. He would give us a long word with, say, 10 letters and ask us to make shorter words of 4 letters or more from the long word. In my sister's case, because they were younger, they were allowed 3 letters or more. And we would then have to come up with words, and whoever got the most words would get a prize. Or he would give us a number of scrambled letters and ask us to form the longest possible word with them. In fact, at one point in our childhood, he invented a precursor of the game we now know as Wordle, which is that he would imagine a 5-letter word and ask us to guess it. It kept us very busy in long car journeys. So we would be guessing the word. Of course, today's Wordle is on the net, and so you have green squares and yellow squares and gray squares that prop up. If you get the right letter in the right space or the right letter in the wrong space, we had none of that. So he gave us 20 terms, just told us how many letters we got right, which meant that it was a real challenge, but it was also a lot of fun. And all of this put together is what made for the love of words that I was forced by my illness to develop, and then encouraged by my father to really wallow in that. And that's why I ended up as a logophile.
Yeah, because I think the book is dedicated to your beloved father, Shashi Tharoor. And you've also spoken, told us in the book and elsewhere how he was a great influence on your development as a writer. So thank you for sharing that beautiful memory.
He was very important to me, and I'm sad to say that he passed away relatively young at the age of 63 before he could see most of my books. But he did see my very first book, which was my PhD thesis, Reasons of State, and my very first novel, The Great Indian Novel. And I remember it was at a book party for The Great Indian Novel that he introduced himself to people as the author's author. That is, he had authored me, and I was the author of the book. And I thought that was a lovely. So I've dedicated the book to the author's author, my father.
Talking of love of words, one of the most interesting words in the book is milver, someone who displays a significant enthusiasm for language and wordplay with people of similar interests.
Yeah.
You're unquestionably a milver. Tell us how and
But
where.
you need another milver. The whole point about being a milver is that it's a relationship with people. So the word was invented, frankly, it never caught on very much. It was invented in the 1930s by an American scholar who wanted a word to describe those who shared an absolute passion, abiding passion with someone else for something, and particularly for words. And milver has one unusual advantage. It is the only word in the English language that rhymes with silver. You think hard, there is no other words. If you're ever writing a poem or a limerick or a doggerel with silver, you need to know milver. And milver, so if you love words as much as I do, then you are my milver and I am yours.
Today, the reading habit among the younger generation is in a decline. Tell us what you think about it and how you think this might be remedied.
You know, Aienla, I actually have an essay on that in the book. By the way, the book is a collection of 101 essays of varying lengths. The introduction and the conclusion are fairly long. The 101 essays in between are pretty short, except for a handful, which are a bit longer than the others. But they're all very short. It's a kind of book you can dip into, depending on the topic that interests you, put it aside, pick it up again. But one of the things that Aienla is asking about is the subject of an essay, which is the declining habit of reading, unfortunately, amongst today's young. I meet too many young parents who tell me their children don't like to read. And there are a number of issues here. I don't know, in Malayalis are probably an exception, because in Kerala, there's still a lot of books being published and a lot of books being read. But, and thank you, you keep Kerala Sahityam alive. But I do want to say that on the whole, this is broadly true around the world, and is certainly true in India too, that serious reading has declined. Partly it's because there are so many distractions, whether it's computer games, whether it's internet, whether it's social media, whether it's YouTube videos and TikTok videos and all that. People have other ways of passing their time, which in the old days they would have spent curled up with a book. And that's become a problem. I remember one defense that one young person told me is, we're reading as much as your generation did. It's just that we're reading on a screen and not between the covers of a book. But actually, there are scholarly studies that say that's not good enough. Because there is something known as complex reading, reading in depth. And that is not there in a WhatsApp forward or a little anecdote or a short little message that comes to you. You may be reading as many words, but you're reading at a level of superficiality that harms you. Secondly, in the 21st century, we are living in an era of fake news, of lies, of distortions, of all sorts of made-up history that goes around on WhatsApp and so on. If you haven't acquired the depth of reading to be able to judge for yourself what is real and what is not, or if you have to know enough to doubt the lies, even if you're not sure they're lies, and then know where to look them up, you are doing yourself a disservice. In fact, people have written, a whole bunch of writers signed a petition in the Slovenian capital Ljubljana called the Ljubljana Manifesto, which I've quoted in the book, which specifically says that this is something that has to be urgently remedied, and we urge society, governments, school systems to go out of their way now to actually create courses in reading and encourage and test reading. Because if we lose this, we lose in many ways the most precious attribute of our civilization.
Thank you. Personally, for me, one of the most popular passages in the book, which displays the power of words, is a letter that the young job seeker Robert Pirosh wrote in 1934. So could you please read out the letter for us?
Yeah, this is actually quite amusing because it's from the introductory chapter, the introduction itself. And here it goes. I think you might actually enjoy this if the sound system is good enough. I'm told that at the back, some of you may have a problem, but we'll see. I'm besotted with words. It's fair to say I love them. But even I could not have expressed my love for words as well as a young job seeker called Robert Pirosh did in 1934 when he headed to Hollywood looking for a new career as a screenwriter. Pirosh was working in advertising in New York and had no connections in the American film industry. But he collected the names and addresses of as many directors, producers, and studio executives as he could find, and he sent them all this brilliant letter. Dear sir, I like words. I like fat, buttery words such as ooze, turpitude, glutinous, toady. I like solemn, angular, creaky words such as straight-laced, cantankerous, pernicious, valedictory. I like spurious, black is white words such as mortician, liquidate, tonsorial, demi-monde. I like suave V words such as Svengali, svelte, bravura, verve. I like crunchy, brittle, crackly words such as splinter, grapple, justly, crusty. I like sullen, crab, scowling words such as skulk, glower, scabby, churl. I like, oh heavens, my gracious land's sake, words such as tricksy, tucker, genteel, horrid. I like elegant, flowery words such as estivate, peregrinate, elysium, halcyon. I like wormy, squirmy, mealy words such as crawl, blubber, squeal, drip. I like sniggly, chuckling words such as cowlick, gurgle, bubble, and burp. I like the word screenwriter better than copywriter, so I decided to quit my job as a New York advertising agency and try my luck in Hollywood. Just before taking the plunge, I went to Europe for a year of study, contemplation, and horsing around. I have just returned, and I still like words. May I have a few with you? So that was the letter, and I would argue that no better job application has ever been written in the English language, and no better pin to the marvels and joys of words either. The letter worked. Pirosh landed 3 job interviews, one of which led to a job as a junior writer at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Studios, the fabled MGM. His career soared. In 1949, screenwriter Robert Pirosh won an Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay for his work on the war film Battleground. A few months after the Oscar, he also won a Golden Globe Award from the Hollywood Foreign Press Association. These were opportunities he might never have landed if he had not loved words enough to craft such a brilliant letter. And I explain all the words later on. If you buy the book and read it, you'll find them.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor. That was a brilliant rendition of the letter. Thank you.
Thank you.
While we are at words, one of the most interesting sections in the book has to do with the many variants of English. Could you talk about some of the words in English that owe their existence to French, German, Australian, Japanese, Indian, and even Irish?
Yeah, I mean, the fact is that the English language borrows shamelessly from other languages. English has more recognized words than any other language. It has, I think, 75,000 in most complete dictionaries. And the Scrabble people, who are far more liberal with what words they allow, they have an official dictionary with 275,000 words. So it's a huge language, and the words are borrowed from every language on earth. In fact, as I mentioned in my book on British colonialism, even India, the British, as I said, took the word loot into their dictionaries as well as their habits while they were here during the colonial era. So the fact is that they took a lot of words, and so many of them are from French. Pretty much everything to do with art, with politics, with representative government, with democracy, all that comes from French origin. It's fascinating. I've got chapters on each, so I'm not going to waste your time with examples. Given lots of examples of words from French, words from German. You'll be surprised, words from Japanese, and words from all sorts of exotic languages. But then, of course, for all of us, there are the Indianisms. I actually begin with an anecdote where I had allowed myself to assume that I was the inventor of the word prepone, because I'd never known anyone using it till I dreamt it up in 1972 as a college student and used it in various articles. And when I came regularly to India over the years as a UN official, I was so gratified to see prepone in conversation. So I put that into an article, and I promptly got a correction from the Oxford English Dictionary people, who said they could find a reference to prepone in 1913 in a letter to the New York Times. But the truth is, of course, that nobody in the West was using prepone. We in India found it useful because we have taken our own liberties with the English language. We have our own usages, some of which are actually sneered at or frowned upon by those who believe in the King's English. But the truth is that it's entirely legitimate, because there are variations of English in Australia and South Africa and Canada and America. Why can't we? I mean, the Americans use words that they had brought with them when they came to America in the 17th century, which fell out of fashion in England, but became the words of choice in America. For example, in England, nowadays you say autumn. In Shakespeare's time, you said fall. So the Americans say fall, they don't say autumn. Okay, or the Americans still say gotten. He's gotten something, he's gotten sick, he's gotten a book, whatever. In England, they say have got, they don't say gotten. So you're seeing that there are differences. Why can't India have its own version? So I have a little chapter on Indian English. And my answer is that Indians can also do what other countries are doing. Even if some words have fallen out of use centuries ago in England, if we're using them in India and we understand what they mean, why can't we use them? Now, I explained that Indian English is a living practical language used by millions every day for practical purposes. And I'm not referring to expressions like satyagraha or namaste or yogi, which have passed to the English language and are used exactly as they are in India. I'm referring to the usage of English words differently in India from the Anglophone West. Now, some, of course, are simply to do with our culture. I mean, we have this habit of never calling elders by their first names, so we say auntie and uncle and so on, which Westerners don't understand. And some was really sort of invented by our media, like this whole expression air dash. Doesn't exist in English, but you know, the chief minister air dashed to Delhi to see the High Command. That's very Indian. Or somebody who's arrested who's a history sheeter. That doesn't exist anywhere else in English, but it does here. Somebody with a long criminal record is a history sheeter. Then some came from school and college usage in India. Mugging. which in India means cramming hard for an exam, where you rote learn, you memorize things from the textbook and from the teacher, and you say, I've been mugging for my exam, would mystify an American or an Englishman, because in their language, in America, a mugging is a criminal assault by a robber, as in she was a victim of a mugging in Central Park. Or in England particularly, it's the elaborate and often comically exaggerated face or expression that some people, particularly irritating teenagers, make for the camera, mugging for the camera. But in neither case has it anything to do with studying. Just as in India, we talk about certain expressions that also come from different circles of our life, like what is your good name? Which is a very Indian usage, and the West doesn't know anything about good names and bad names, but in many Indian languages, say in Bengali, for instance, everyone has a bhalo naam, which is their good name, and a dark naam, which is the name they're actually called. That's very common in Indian culture, but there is no such expression. You can speak of a nickname, but you don't have a good name in the West. And so it goes. But I also have a little thing about matrimonial ads, which have created their own cultural tropes with expressions that only mean something in Indian English. Wheatish complexion, of course. And better still, traditional with modern outlook. Many ads require a prospective bride in India to be homely. Now, in the West, homely means plain, bad looking. In India, homely means home-loving, traditional, a good housekeeper. And many ads also require somebody to have passed out from a convent school. Now, you don't, in the West, if you pass out, it means you lose consciousness, you faint. But in India, no, you have to stay awake and pass your examinations. So it doesn't mean passed out, it means graduated from a convent school. In other words, a school established by a missionary order. Some Indianisms are creative uses of an ordinary English word or phrase to reflect a peculiarly Indian sensibility, such as kindly adjust, said apologetically by the seventh person slipping onto a bench meant for four. We have nothing to apologize about. We should defiantly celebrate their use as integral parts of our Indian English vocabulary. After all, we are like that only. And if you don't like it, kindly adjust.
Dr. Tharoor, from a lighter note to a more serious question, there are fascinating differences between American and British English. Could you touch briefly on those differences?
There's so many, but I'm not sure that we get away from the lighter note, because one of my favorite stories about the difference between American and British English is about the is about the American tourist who left, as he thought, his pants behind in the closet of the hotel, and he needed the pants. So he called the hotel and said, I've left my pants in the closet. And nobody at the other end could understand what he was saying. And finally, somebody said, after they'd gone through 3 or 4 Englishmen, somebody said, you left your trousers in the wardrobe. Why didn't you say so in the first place? You know, I mean, okay, these things are changing now because Americanisms are far more common. But conversely, when the British use trousers in a wardrobe, most Americans won't understand what either of them mean. But there are lots of other usages, and there's some which can really trip you up. I've got a few examples in the book. Some happened to me when I first went to America as a graduate student. I asked somebody, where can I post a letter to my parents? And the answer given to me is, there's a bulletin board at the student center, but are you sure you want to post something so personal? Because in America, to post is to publish something, to put it on a notice board, or to put it on social media. Whereas, of course, the weird thing is they say you should mail letters. But in America, too, you mail them at the post office. So I didn't quite get why they meant, but that's how it is. There's a lot of much funnier WhatsApp forwards going on around about all of this American English. But another one that amused me no end was this English friend who said he nearly had a heart attack when the American pilot announced that the plane was taking off momentarily. Because in English, momentarily means for a moment. So he thought the pilot was announcing an imminent crash. Whereas in American, momentarily means in a moment, which means just about to take off. That's what he meant. So these kinds of things can trip you up quite a bit. More serious ones will be things like um, uh, our former Foreign Minister M.C. Chagla told the story of how, when he went to the United Nations General Assembly, he wanted to order a modest bite from room service in a New York hotel. So he called down and asked for sandwiches. How many do you want? He was asked. Imagining delicate little triangles of thinly sliced bread, he replied, oh, half a dozen should be enough. 6 sandwiches duly arrived, each about a foot long and 4 inches high. I mean, that's America for you. And the language of politics is also not exempt from the politics of language. When an MP in Britain tables a resolution, he puts it forward for debate and passage. When an American congressman tables a resolution, it means he kills it off. A moot point is a point an Englishman wants to argue. But in American, a moot point is one that's null and void. So you can really trip up if you don't know these differences. And then there are the obvious cultural differences, as I said, about India. For example, the British stand for election, the Americans run for it. Very cultural difference. A British linguist once told a New York audience that whereas a double negative could make a positive, there was no language in the world in which a double positive made a negative. This is an actual lecture by a linguist. And an American heckler paid to his thesis in forthright American. Yeah, right. It's a double positive that made a negative. Yeah, right means no, it's not true. Anyway, so that's some examples for you.
Thank you. You say as a politician, you've become all too accustomed to hyperbole. Could you please tell us about it? As a politician, you've become all too accustomed to hyperbole. So tell us about it.
Hyperbole is simply about exaggeration. I mean, it's not just in politics, frankly. Yeah, in politics, people are guilty of hyperbole. They promise the moon, literally. But of course, in normal life, I mean, how many romantics have promised the moon to their loved ones? I mean, this is normal. Hyperbole is an expression that essentially involves coming up with various forms of expression. The question is, you've got to understand the difference between hyperbole and taking terms literally. Sorry, I'm just looking at some examples just to illustrate the thing more promptly. Hyperbole. So here's one. One very famous English hyperbole is, if I'm wrong, I'll eat my hat. I don't think anyone's actually eaten a hat. And once when a politician was challenged to eat his hat, he had a cake baked in the shape of a hat and ate it. But that's a typical piece of hyperbole. Or how many parents say, my poor boy, his school bag weighs a ton. The point is, obviously, it doesn't weigh a ton, but you get the message. Hyperbole serves to make the point that by exaggeration, by conveying it. So the American humorist Will Rogers, for instance, you see, hyperbole can be used to convey or express humor, contempt, political views, and all sorts of emotions, from excitement to distress. And so the American humorist Will Rogers at one point said, by combining all these purposes, when he said of a particular politician that if brains were gunpowder, he wouldn't have enough to blow wax out of his ears. Now, can you imagine how many things are being said in that hyperbole? But we're using hyperbole all the time in a normal language. I've already told you this 1,000,000 times, we say every day. Or I'm buried under a mountain of paperwork, we say at the office. Or we say, that lady has a mile-wide smile. Or you tell a woman, I'll go to the ends of the earth for you. Yeah, just watch you going to the South Pole for her. But the point is that these things are absolutely typical hyperbole. That's all. And there's some great literary ones, in particular, that I've quoted, which I won't waste your time on now, but there are lots of examples in the chapter on hyperbole. Did you have something particularly in mind when you asked?
No, I think I'll move on to the next question, which is along the same vein. There are many aspects of the English language that we use without really knowing much about them, like acronyms. We know acronyms. We know what alliterations are. We know what aptograms are. But could you enlighten us about more obscure aspects like backronyms, contronyms, aptograms, kennings?
I don't know if we'll have enough time for all of those, but there are chapters on each of these things that Aienla is asking about. So backronyms are back formation. That is, you get a well-known acronym and you invent a phrase, even though that wasn't really the origin of the phrase. And in particular, people love doing this for airline names, especially when I was growing up. We all had expansions for all of these. So for example, British Airways used to be called the British Overseas Airways Corporation, or BOAC. And the backronym for BOAC was Better on a Camel. Delta Airlines in America, the backronym was Doesn't Ever Leave the Airport. Belgium had a national airline called Sabena, because it was an acronym derived from a French phrase, Société Anonyme Belge d'Exploitation de la Navigation Aérienne. So that was Sabena. And the acronym given was magnificent. Such a bad experience, never again. But my personal favorite was the backronym for Alitalia. Arrived late in Tokyo and luggage in Amsterdam.
I'm sure they're going to be sorry.
But if you're curious about more of these, about aptograms, about contronyms and eponyms, I think you should read the book, because they're really, I've tried to convey them through anecdotes and wits, and I know we don't have a whole lot of time and that you do have questions from the audience. So I'll try and not go into too many examples, but let's take an example of a contronym, because many people use contronyms without perhaps fully realizing what they are. I'll give you an example of that. So one very common contronym, which you'll come across in your newspapers all the time, is the word sanction. A contronym is a word that can also mean the opposite of itself. So if, for example, you say that the president of US has sanctioned Iranian oil supplies, it can literally mean two things which are the opposite of each other. Sanction means to give permission for, and sanction also means to prohibit. So, ironically, he could have been saying that the president had permitted oil supplies to flow, or that he had prohibited them. And therefore, it's a misleading headline, but it happens all the time. Because the word sanction can apply either to approval for a course of action or a penalty for disobeying an injunction. It's actually, the contronyms are what they call Janus words, after the Roman god Janus, who had two faces looking in opposite directions. So I'll give you a couple more examples, because these are so common in our every usage. The most common contronym might be the word off. Since setting off an alarm activates a warning bell, switching off the alarm deactivates it, and both use the same off. If you find too many objects are gathering dust at home, you can tell your maid that she needs to dust more. But there also is going to be, as a result, less dust. Similarly, strike can be used to mean to create, as in strike a deal, or to eliminate, strike that line from the record. So you have all these contronyms, and there are very, very many more in the book. But just to give you an example of how figures of speech exist, very often in our common usage, and we're not entirely conscious of them. So, I mean, the book is also meant, as the cover illustration rather sweetly shows, a father reading it with his daughter. The idea is it's a book that adults can enjoy just for the fun of it, but young people can also learn from. So that's the purpose of these essays.
Thank you. I'm sure the audience will have lots of questions, so I'm just going to ask a couple more before
Sure.
I open the questions to the audience. There are some latest entrants in the English language. So can you tell us how they were adopted by the gatekeepers of the English language?
Well, we have no gatekeepers in the English language. That's the funny thing. I mean, the French, for example, have the Académie Française. So if you use words in French, the Académie Française has to approve them. And if they disapprove, you're not supposed to use them. I'll give you an example. When the French started using the Western or American or British expression, the weekend, and they started saying le weekend, the Académie Française said, no, you cannot say le weekend, it is not French. You have to say la fin de semaine. And the truth is that, in fact, the French continue saying the weekend, but some say la fin de semaine out of respect for the Académie Française. We have no Académie Anglaise or English Academy to tell us what we can and cannot say. Yeah, some people say that the only English that's acceptable is what the BBC uses, but the BBC itself has been going around now with announcers using various kinds of accents. It's no longer the so-called received pronunciation or the Queen's English that was broadcast from inner London. Various kinds of Scottish and Irish and Welsh and other accents can be heard on the BBC. So the language is diverse, and that is English's greatest strength. It accommodates, it welcomes, it actually takes in more words. Now, one of the challenges we have is that every generation then comes up with new words of its own. I remember my generation, we used to say things that the earlier generation used to look down upon, like hip and cool and groovy, which today seem hopelessly quaint to the younger people, but which were, you know, these sort of fancy sort of slang and colloquial expressions of my time when I was in college. Now, what's happening is that there is now a situation that new words are coming into the English language from each new generation. And I was asked once on a television show to test my knowledge of millennial English. I guessed my way past some of the answers and stumbled at the rest. So one could guess more or less the connotations of fleek, slay, and even adulting from the way they sounded. But how was one to know that quiche meant hotter than hot? The generation gap is a cliche, but the use of language is the clearest example of its existence. Today's young have evolved a vocabulary that means nothing to their parents, and that shouldn't surprise anyone, since the same charge has been leveled at every previous generation. But while most of us can understand why it's cool to be seen with a hot date, being told that someone is a snack requires a cultural leap. After all, since when was a cheese toast or a medu vada a symbol of attractiveness? Millennials refers to the generation born between 1980 and 1994. And as a parent of two of that vintage and uncle to four others, I'm relieved that they have largely not chosen to address me in such language. But they've already been succeeded by two more cohorts, Generation Z, or Generation Z if you're American, 1995 to 2012, sometimes called the Zoomers, and a generation born after 2010, which is increasingly called Generation Alpha. And anyone born after this year is probably going to be called Generation Beta, not Beta as the Hindi wallahs might assume. Now, the better known millennial and Gen Z expressions are not new words, but familiar English words, now assign different meanings by the young. So woke has nothing to do with what happened to you with your alarm clock. It means socially aware. Lit connotes something that's amazing or fun. Thirsty means desperate for attention, like many politicians, right? Others have become part of the routine currency of everyday life in the 21st century, like meme, fishing with a PH, viral, selfie. Some others don't depart very far from the original meanings. Low-key on a millennial's tongue means not quiet, but subtle. Fit refers to a person's overall clothing ensemble. It's short for outfit. And shook means shaken. And in the era of Netflix and OTT platforms, there are more expressions that have come in, like to binge watch, to watch multiple episodes of a show or entire series in one sitting. I still have no idea why dope means excellent, and sick expresses admiration or high approval for something impressive or exciting, but these are now all usages. Then there are all the acronyms that came in with texting and WhatsApp. So you all know FOMO, right? Fear of missing out. A millennial creation. There are apparently confusions because some millennials use FOMO for fear of moving on, the reluctance to let go of a past relationship. Similarly, GYAT or GAT can either mean get your act together or goddamn you are thick. Apparently an expression of approval for a person you find attractive or someone with a substantial backside. And I'll just end with a passage from the end of the conclusion. This actually was a result of an experiment. a New York Times journalist interviewed half a dozen alphas, this current youngster generation. They were between 8 and 10 years of age when she interviewed them about their vocabulary. Many of the children cited a catchy parody song making the rounds on TikTok to help her understand the usage. And the lyrics, which she quoted in the New York Times, were incomprehensible to me. Sticking out your gat for the Rizzler, you're so skibbity, you're so phantom tax, I just want to be your Sigma. Do any of you understand any of that? No. But having Riz is when you've got good game, one child explained. Being a Rizzler is when you're a pro at flirting with people. Sticking out your gat refers to drawing attention to your backside. These are 10-year-olds. Another child added that nobody really knows the meaning of skibbity, but you may have seen the Oxford English Dictionary named it the most popular word for the Generation Alpha. It apparently entered the lexicon by way of an animated cartoon series, Skibbity Toilet, which has human-headed toilets who just happen to have CCTV cameras, speakers, and televisions instead of heads. That's Skibbity. So there are 700 million views for this on YouTube. Phantom tax, it seems, refers to Phantom, F-A-N-U-M, a popular streamer on Twitch who regularly appears online and insists that people who are eating in his presence should share their food with him. And Sigma, I want to be your Sigma, has something to do with wolves. Everyone in my grade, says the kid, says it in a way where they're like the alpha of the pack. If you're trying to say you're dominant and you're the leader, you'll call yourself Sigma. So as you know, our politics is full of people who want to be your Sigma. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor. Thank you, audience, for being a wonderful audience. We will now open the floor for questions.
And you got to pick the question, as Aienla. Whoever gives you the mic will get you a chance to answer. There's a mic going around somewhere, is there?
Yeah.
Oh, whoever has the mic may as well speak and then move it over to that side.
Yeah, in one of your recent talks, I happened to hear about the word that you coined. I don't know if you've coined the word, but the word in Malayalam is etramate.
That's right.
Yeah.
Somebody asked me, can you invent a word in English that English doesn't have? And I can tell you a word in Malayalam that English doesn't have, which is etramate. Imagine if you're an American going to rent a car in a whole bunch of rental cars in a parking lot, and there are sort of 10 rows and each one has 20 cars. You have to ask, hey, in which row, in what number position is my car, what color and what make is it? It's a very long way of asking. Etramate vandiyanende. Right. So in Malayalam, we have a word that will convey the ordinal position of an object or an individual in a specific line or sequence. And there is no word in English, one word for that. So I said, why not come up with wet? You got when, what, why, which, why not wet? Wet means which number position in a line is my particular, you're going to come here and somebody tells you, oh, my friend is sitting in the 7th row, and you say, etramate ala nadye, and you can see which particular friend they want you to meet.
Can you put that in a sentence?
Yeah, sure. So somebody says, I'd like you to meet my friend. He's sitting in your audience. He's in the 7th row. And I would say, wet person is he?
Right. That's very amusing.
Thank you for that confabulation.
Thank
Do
you.
you know that word? What do you think of the word of the year, this year and last year's? I'm sure you know them.
Well, I've already written essays on the 3 words of the year before I wrote this book, but this year's, I have seen it in the newspaper. I haven't registered it. Remind me what it is. I'll tell you. I remember there was one saying Riz. Was that last year? That was last year. Because the problem with Riz is it's a totally unnecessary contraction of the word charisma. What's this year's word? Brain what? Rot. That's what's happening to us in the 21st century. We're also completely inundated with irrelevant and frankly sometimes dishonest or fake information that our brains are really in danger of rotting. So I think brain rot is not a bad contribution to the language. Yeah.
First of all, I thank you for the what I'm to say, very sagacious rendering on the language and in the nuances of the language.
Thank you.
First of all, another question that I want to put before you is the present status of English language. Actually, I feel because in some European countries even,
Yeah.
English is not as popular even like, I mean, as India. And of course, English language is a library, I mean, for a reading and for other purposes, English language is dominating. Well, because we don't have any other foreign languages to depend upon. But suppose in so many European countries even, English is not as popular as even India.
Can I answer you?
Another question that I want to put is, even in India, the prestige of the language is ebbing with law, I mean, because of the present ruling regime is absolutely not, what I'm to say, pro to the movements, because of the popularity and the popular voting demands of the people, all like that. So, how you evaluate the present prestige
First of
the
all,
English?
sir, I think you're both wrong and right. You're wrong in that English still is the most widely spoken language in the world. It's spoken by more people than any other language, even than Chinese. And the Chinese is mainly spoken in one country, whereas English is spoken in more countries than any other language in the world. Secondly, even though you're right that many countries have their own languages, it is actually the favored second language in schools across Europe. In most European countries, both in Western Europe, of course, this was the case for the last 60, 70 years, where places from Germany to Scandinavian countries, Western Europe, even France, the first foreign language you learn after your mother tongue. Always they teach first in the mother tongue, but by the 5th grade or sometimes sooner, in Scandinavia, it's often from the 1st grade, you are taught English as a second language. So even if it is not your principal language, it is your second language. Now in Eastern Europe, after the fall of the Soviet Union, even countries where Russian used to be the second language, countries of the former Soviet bloc, have taken English as their second language for the most part. So you're seeing some continuing popularity for English beyond a shadow of a doubt, and in a globalized world, English became the preferred second language of communication. So if a Malayali is trying to talk to a German to sell him a product, what language would he speak? The Malayali doesn't know German, the German doesn't know Malayalam, he'll definitely speak English. That's what's happened, and that's why English actually gained in popularity. When the internet came on board, the English gained even further popularity because there were, at one time, I'm talking 5 or 6 years ago, 90% of the material on the internet was principally in English. Others had to take it in English and then translate it into their languages. Now, the one thing that makes you possibly right is the advent of artificial intelligence, which has created new translation tools that may make it unnecessary for you to learn English as a second language. Why? Because you can probably just know your own language, go around with a mobile phone that has software on it, and when somebody's speaking to you in any other language, you'll turn the software on, hold the phone to him, and your software will repeat what he or she has said to you in your language. The day is not far off that that's going to happen. So you are, I think, to begin with, your assumption is not accurate, but in the future, you may not have to worry about a particular individual language because you may have, thanks to artificial intelligence, the ability to talk to people in any language, including in your own, and be understood through translation software from artificial intelligence. That day is not far away, certainly within the lifetimes of many of the young people in this room. But till then, English is by far the most useful second language for anybody in the world.
Sir, it is a great boon to have a talk with you.
Thank you.
Sir, you being the most reputed intellectual scholar of Kerala origin, see, I have gone through all your writings so far published.
Thank you, sir.
And I'm really, I don't know how to congratulate you for your skill in the language and communication. It's amazing, and to hear you is very beautiful. But apart, it's Dr. Ambedkar's on observation on intellectual and scholar. I think you may be aware of it. A scholar, of course, is a very learned man, but an intellectual is a person who can think above his caste prejudices of his origin.
Thank you, sir.
But in that case, so far, India has not produced a single intellectual from caste Hindus. That's the reality. And you being a Shudra of fourth Varna from Kerala, your two observations that you are proud of being a Hindu. I don't know, Shudra, according to Adi Shankara, I call him Adi Bhigara, is a walking graveyard, according to Adi Shankara. So such a contemptuous category you belong, Shudra, but still you are very proud of being a Hindu. And apart from that, no RSS ideologue has never become bold to accuse Muslims for being the reason of Sadi system. You have done it. I'm really confused. I'm really confused about your intellectual honesty. Please clarify it.
Thank you, sir. Well, first of all, let me correct you on two things. Number one, yes, I'm very proud of my intellectual honesty because I have the nerve, the courage, or the foolishness to express my views openly, and they've been consistent throughout. But in both your stories, sir, you've slightly misunderstood the situation. With Adi Shankara, don't forget that he made the point that Hinduism has a lot of texts from which you end up selecting, and he himself 1,000 years ago selected a limited number of texts to absolutely focus his bhashyas on. But in his own life story, there is a wonderful story of him walking in Banaras across a narrow bridge, accompanied by his followers. And coming the opposite way is a Chandala, a Dalit, as we would say in today's terms. And the followers of Adi Shankara brusquely tell the Chandala, move aside for the great sage. The Chandala holds his ground. He doesn't move aside. And he addresses Adi Shankara and he says, what do you want me to move? My body or my soul? After all, haven't you taught us that my Atman, the Atman inside me, is the same as the Atman inside you? And Adi Shankara falls at the feet of the Chandala and says, and then embraces him and says, you have mastered my teachings better than my own followers. And he steps aside for the Chandala to pass. Now, this is also Adi Shankara's teaching, that ultimately distinctions of caste are social and professional distinctions. They are not anchored in the philosophy of Hinduism. So when I've written Why I'm a Hindu, which unfortunately I don't think you've read carefully, sir, you will find that I've explained I am not at all a believer in the caste system in any shape or form, whether in the Chaturvarna system or in any of the teachings of the Manusmriti. But I believe, as a close reader of Hindu philosophy, that Hindu philosophy allows me as a believing Hindu to pick and choose what I wish to anchor my belief in. I am a strong follower of both Adi Shankara and Swami Vivekananda. And Swami Vivekananda taught us very much, as you know, by quoting the Shiva Mahimna Stotram all the time. He would say that just as many rivers would flow, some downhill, some through valleys, some straight, some winding, and end up in the same sea, so also all forms of worship are equally valid. And therefore, for the Hindu to respect others and to accept the differences that they may exist in society amongst human beings is an act of acceptance and not an act of contempt. As far as I'm concerned, I have no problem if people choose to judge me by my salary or my education or my income or my job or what caste I'm born. That's their problem. I don't happen to judge people that way. I judge them by who they are, the qualities they have, the content of their character. On the question of sati, sir, I have never excused sati. I have been a staunch critic of sati and an admirer of those who fought against it. Particularly, I went to high school in Calcutta and admired Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, who not only fought against sati, but Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar went further and said, these widows who are not going to immolate themselves in the pyre, we should encourage their remarriage because of the prohibitions in Hindu social practice against remarriage. And he himself set the example by remarrying a widow. So the point is that I have never condoned sati. But if you're giving a historical explanation for why the practice became prevalent, it was from the days of invasions and attacks when certain people, from their sense of honor, whether you think it's misguided or not, said that they would rather die than be captured alive. and in particular many women. There are so many stories in Rajasthan, because that was a state which fought a lot of these wars since the invasions came from the northwest, where women either committed sati or collectively committed johar. That is, they all collectively set themselves on fire, threw themselves into a burning fire, and so on. That is a historical explanation. It is not a justification. And that difference, sir, you must understand. You can accuse me of many things, but never of intellectual dishonesty, sir. I will always be honest in everything I say.
Thank you. That's all we have time for this
Time is
morning. Once again, thank you so much, Dr. Tharoor, for your time.
Thank you all. Thanks. You've been a great audience.